Really lovely to see you all here. Just before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I'll give you a quick overview of the next two events we've got coming up, both of which are book launches. Next week on Monday the 20th. Monday, not Wednesday, our normal day. This is Monday because there's an academic conference going on the Wednesday. We're hosting a book launch for Susan Weingarten. Susan has just published a book with Routledge Press, What's Cooking in the Talmuds, What's Cooking in the Talmuds, Jewish Food in its Geographical and Cultural Contexts. That's here, 5 o'clock, Monday the 20th. And with the book launch, we do a little bit of a different kind of format. Susan will give a presentation on her book, but we'll then have two respondents as well. Limor Jungmann from Hebrew University and Yuval Saha from Tel Aviv University. Susan, of course, is a food historian and a long-standing associate fellow here at the Albright. And then on Wednesday, back to our usual Wednesday, the 29th of October, we have our very own Rodney Ace from St. George College, and his book that is just published, Walking the Jerusalem Circuit in the Footsteps of Pilgrims Before the Crusades. This one is going to be held in the courtyard in the end of October. Bring a jacket. And I apologize to the folks on Zoom, although we normally Zoom all of our lectures. Unfortunately, when we do a courtyard event, we can't do that. So this one is an exclusive for those in Jerusalem yourselves, or those who can, of course, get hold of Rodney's book. And just to let you know about our centennial events, this year is a really important year for the Albright because it's 100 years since the opening and the construction of the building in which we're sitting, and of course 125 years since the founding of the Albright, or at least the American Schools of Oriental Research, as we were founded in 1900. We were going to celebrate in style in June this year. Bibi and the Ayatollah had different ideas. So June next year, we are having our centennial event. The calendar diary to mark is June 27th. We'll have that as a big reception. Watch this space. However, as part of that centennial event, we've been doing a centennial campaign. That centennial campaign is designed to grow our endowment. The endowment is the reason why we're here. It allows us to keep the lights on. And in moments like this, where we lose our US government funding, which is tremendously critical, having an endowment makes it the only reason why we can continue to stay here doing our job, unlike some other institutions that rely more heavily on government funding. It is critical that we grow that endowment for the next 100 years of our health. How do you do that? Well, you can go onto our webpage and donate under Centennial Giving. You'll find under there the possibility of purchasing a named brick. Here's one for Norma Diva. Norma has paid $250 for a named brick for yourself or on behalf of someone else to go into a pathway of donors in the orchard down the back. And of course, there's a variety of naming opportunities around the campus for larger donations, for which please do get in touch. If you're not on our emailing list and want to be for events, you'll also find a tab to join our email list on the top. But let's get back onto why we're all here. It is a real pleasure to introduce Moritz Adam as our speaker tonight. Moritz teaches Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism at the University of Zurich. This is where he received his doctorate of theology in 2024 after earning a master, an MA and an MPhil at the University of Oxford. Moritz's research focuses on the history of ideas in Second Temple Judaism, and he takes a particular interest in moments of transition in Jewish literature and thought, and its relationship with classical literature in the ancient Near East. He is the author of not one but two forthcoming books. The first is an edited volume titled Anti-Apocalypticism Throughout Antiquity. This is published through Tübingen. And another is a history on ancient Israel from the late Bronze Age to the Bar Kokhba revolt, published by the Theologia Verlag in Zurich. Moritz is here in Jerusalem and at the Albright as our Freix's annual professor, and he is in residence until the end of the year. Moritz, over to you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Jamie, for having me. Thank you very much to the Albrights. Also, many, many thanks to the staff of the house who've prepared this room very wonderfully, and also to everybody who's giving to the Albright and hopefully continues to give through Albright, because without you, we couldn't do the things that we do here. In the Jerusalem Talmud, an episode is recounted about a famous tradition of Alexander the Great having ascended to heaven. Rabbi Jonah of Tiberias, a figure of the Amoraic period, is cited to have related that, quote, when Alexander the Macedonian wanted to ascend, he rose and rose and rose until he saw the world as a globe and the ocean like a ball. Therefore, one represents him with a globe in his hand. Rabbi Jonah is the earliest extant source which refers to a famous tale which would find substantial attestation in an idiosyncratic codex called El, which is part of the better tradition of Pseudo-Callisthenes' Greek Alexander Romance, and appends upon this tradition of fabulous tales about Alexander's travels to the east. In this episode, upon having arrived in a place called the Land of the Blessed, Alexander is said to have fashioned for himself a chariot with which, carried by birds, he had ascended to the heavens. The episode, which exerted a profound influence upon the artistic and literary imagination of both the medieval period and modernity, is described in this text as follows, quote, and once again I reflected and asked to myself, that is Alexander speaking, whether this really was the end of the world and whether heaven was descending towards the earth. I now sought to discover the truth and ordered two of the birds in this place to be caught. They were very large white birds, extraordinarily strong and trusting, for they did not flee at the sight of us. On the third day, I had a piece of wood made in the shape of a yoke and attached it to their necks. I shaped a cowhide into a basket and climbed inside. Immediately the birds flew away, and I rose into the air with them, feeling as if I'd reached towards the heavens. My whole body trembled because of the excessive cold of the air created by the beats of the birds' wings. Finally, a winged creature in human form came towards me and said, Alexander, do you not understand earthly things and strive for heavenly ones? Return quickly to earth, lest you become food for these birds. It went on to say to me, Alexander looked down at the earth. Full of fear, I looked down and saw a large snake bent in a circle, and inside the round structure, like a very small threshing floor. Then my companion said, now point your spear at the threshing floor, for that is the earth, but the serpent is the sea that surrounds the earth. But I turned back and by the will of fate returned to earth 7 days away from my army, and I resolved never again to attempt the impossible. While the literary instantiations of the myths of Alexander's heavenly journeys arise at length only in late antiquity, they are clearly embedded in earlier realms of thought and literary traditions which, I will argue here, meaningfully bridge classical literature with the Eastern Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, including Jewish sources. Beyond the reference to such transcendental travels in the rabbinic text that I gave to you just now, even older materials from the centuries before the turn of the ages, which are more immediately concerned with Alexander, also engage the premises of these later legends. Of particular interest is an apostrophe in the lightly spurious work from the Corpus Aristotelicum called De Mundo. In this pseudo-Aristotelian text, Aristotle is said to have said the following to Alexander, wrote, I have often thought, Alexander, that philosophy is a divine and really godlike activity, particularly in those instances when it alone has exalted itself to the contemplation of the universe and sought to discover the truth that is in it. It was not possible by means of the body to reach the heavenly region or to leave the earth and explore that heavenly place. So the soul, by means of philosophy, taking the mind as its guide, has crossed the frontier and made the journey out of its own land a path that does not tire the traveler. It has embraced in thought the things that are most widely separated from each other in place, for it had no difficulty, I think, in recognizing things that were related to it, and with the soul's divine eye grasped all things divine and interpreted them for mankind, end quote. In contradistinction to the legendary accounts of Alexander's travels, whose literary manifestations are only available to posterity from much later sources, Pseudo-Aristotle suggests that the physical travel to heaven, which Alexander was said to have attempted, was impossible, and that a philosophically trained exploration of heavenly matters was not only possible but preferable. In the passage in De Mundo, whose connection to the traditions of the Alexander romance has been dealt with in depth by Richard Stoneman, opens up an intriguing conceptual links between two important questions. It links the intellectual histories of two modes of heavenly travels, which can be traced across a range of cultures of antiquity from the Eastern Mediterranean and can mutually inform one another. One concerns the question of the development and intercultural dissemination of royal travel journeys. The other, a rather more intellectual phenomenon, namely that of the flight of the mind, that is the mental or intellectual exploration of strange, often transcendental spaces, which are accessed by exemplarized literary characters, which serve less as a description of an actually imagined space than as an authorizing reference point, which can surpass and outweigh the conventions, principles, and systems of experienced reality. Without seeking to develop the immediate causes of transmission of these motifs between sources and across cultures in every given case, my contribution seeks to accomplish three things. First, a broad panorama will be painted of the place of the flight of the mind text from classical literature and how this motif attaches itself upon a broad variety of traditions, regularly with rhetorically authorizing intentions and effects with respect to the speakers or protagonists in question in the respective works. Second, a connection will be established between this rather more philosophically colored trope and modes of authority construction in different, more earthly or physical travel accounts from classical antiquity. Finally, a new conceptual link is proposed with particular attention to the history of thought and literature of ancient Judaism. Jewish texts, especially ones of the Hellenistic period and beyond, frequently make their literary subjects cross into transcendental spaces and use visionary and revelatory accounts not merely to set out their epistemic frameworks, but also to authorize social and political perspectives or religious convictions within the circumstances of their time. It is proposed here that the rhetorical aims and shapes exhibit meaningful similarities to classical thought, so that a comparison and intellectual integration of discourses from the field of classics can be beneficial also for the understanding of ancient Judaism. Part first, the flight of the mind. The motif of the mind exploring heavenly realms is an intriguing topos in classical literature. Its prominence is indebted to its place in the Greek philosophical literature, especially first in Plato. In his reflection of the soul, in his dialogue with Phaedrus, he had suggested that the soul has wings and traveled with the gods around the heavens, glimpsing eternal realities, but that this state could be disrupted, whereupon souls would descend and take an embodied state on earth. Plato describes this fall of the soul and its capacity in an earthly state as follows. But when, lacking the power to follow, the soul does not see, and having experienced some mischance, it is weighed down, and having been weighed down, it loses its wings and falls towards the earth, then the law is that the soul shall not, on its first coming into being, implant into any bestial nature, but the one soul that has seen the most things shall implant in that which will engender a man who will become a philosopher or lover of the beautiful, or someone musical and erotic. And this is the recollection of those things that our soul saw once upon a time when it proceeded along with God and looked down upon the things that we now assert to be and lifted up its head into the being that really is. And therefore, justly indeed, only the philosopher's thought is furnished with wings, for through memory he is always, to the best of his power, near those things, though being near what is divine. While Plato is predominantly interested in metaphysical questions concerning the origins and properties of the soul, his argument reaches further and extends and exerts interpretive potential for other kinds of literature. He regards the mind as the entity which has the capacity to see all things and to understand the substance of their being. The recollection of that which the mind had perceived in its previous winged state, therefore, is thought to evoke in the philosopher a longing for spiritual ascent. Plato expresses this process in distinctly aesthetic terms, namely that, quote, someone seeing beauty here below and recollecting true beauty is furnished with wings and raises his new wings with eager striving to fly up, end quote. Since this longing for assent now is not universally available to all, it accords a distinct privileged position to those whose minds are thus enabled, in Plato's terms, to philosophers. Intriguingly, however, other classical authors avail themselves of this motif not only with respect to reflections upon the nature and place of philosophy, but also of other intellectual affairs. The famous example of this is a pericope towards the end of Book 2 of Virgil's Georgics, in which he looks beyond his rural and agricultural topics and discusses the task and place of the poet. He regards flights of the mind too as something which must be initiated, and contrasts it at first glance with rather more experiential musings upon the worldly reality which informs the Georgics. He writes, "For my own part, my chiefest prayer would be, may the sweet muses whose acolyte I am, smitten with boundless love, accept my service. Teach me to know the paths of the stars in heaven, the eclipses of the sun and the moon's travels, the cause of earthquakes, what it is that forces deep seas to swell and burst their barriers and then to sink again, why winter suns hasten so fast to plunge themselves into the ocean, or what it is that slows the lingering nights. But if some chill in the blood about the heart bars me from mastering these sides of nature, then I will pray that I might find fulfillment in the country and the streams that water valleys, love rivers and woods unglamorous." End quote. Virgil aspires in the present passage to join the famous tradition of, in his words, probing the causes of things and seeking a home in lands beneath an alien sun, in respect to which he is especially indebted to Lucretius. He understands this move, however, not to attribute the capacity to ascend into such realms to inherent properties of the soul or the mind, as Plato had, but rather to acknowledge that this step lies beyond his own ability and requires initiation, which, in typical poetic terms, is dependent upon the inspiration which is related by muses. He is here indebted in a rich tradition, as likewise intellectual contemporaries of his had invoked this tradition of mental ascent, among them Lucretius in the proem to his Epicurean didactic poem De Rerum Naturae, or Heraclitus Homericus in his Homeric Questions, which interpreted the Iliad and the Odyssey allegorically. Principally, in much literature of this period, a connection is established between the contemplation of transcendental or cosmic things and the revelation of mysteries. For instance, Seneca, in his Naturalis Questionis, invokes for himself more positively what Virgil had merely longed for, stating in the prologue of Book 1 to, quote, "give thanks to the nature whenever I see her not in her public aspect, but when I have entered her more secret regions. If I were not allowed access to these questions, it would not have been worth being born," end quote. It follows, therefore, that the exploration, or perhaps the traversing into questions beyond experienced reality, consistently took on, across the course of his literary development, the property of being elusive and something to which access must be granted. It is difficult, as has at times been attempted, to introduce more religiously colored language, such as the revelation of mysteries or other religious connotations, consistently across this analysis of these classical traditions. While some sources deliberately invoke cosmological investigations as attempts at communicating with the gods, for example, Heraclitus Homericus calls Homer the hierophant of heaven and the gods, and the call to the muses in Virgil above is a religious characteristic. The religious dynamic of the text in question appears not usually to be the first principle of these investigations in question, but rather a catalyst or an effect which goes along with the business of philosophy. In Virgil, there's now a further element to his understanding of the flight of the mind topos, which becomes apparent when considering the relationship between the previously considered end of the second Georgic and the beginning of the following third. As Philip Hardy has shown, there exists a conceptual link between the initiated exploring capacities of the mind and the role of poetry celebrating the Roman Imperium. He suggests that there is an indirect association between the two, so that the capacity which in Virgil is accorded to the poet as one who has been granted access to knowledge and mysteries also calls for them to regard political poetry as part of the wider reflections upon life, meaning, and country that are expanded in the Georgics. To explore the matter just a bit more, another shading of the nexus between travel and authority appears in the further work of Latin poetry of the 1st century CE, which is the Astronomica by the Roman poet of possibly Syrian origin Marcus Manilius. Manilius's work, which traverses the boundaries of epic and didactic poetry, is also intellectually and formally indebted to Lucretius and describes celestial phenomena of a deterministic universe. It is in the present discussion the final example which is adduced to show traversal to be a fundamental principle of didactic poetry, which in some characteristics could even be traced back beyond Lucretius and Virgil to Hesiod's works and days. Manilius sets out in the Astronomica a fundamental distinction between the minuscule world of the mind and of experienced reality, as opposed to the unconfined space of the cosmos, thus repeating through the use of contrastive elements of scale a key motif of Hellenistic poetry. He then describes himself in this role as being exclusively capacitated to, in Platonic terms, undertake a flight of the mind, and avails himself of the imagery of driving a chariot to heaven, which was earlier already introduced in the tradition of Alexander the Great. He writes, "This is the theme I should wish with breath inspired to carry to the stars. Not in the crowd nor for the crowd shall I compose my song, as though borne round in an empty circuit I were freely driving my car, with none to cross my paths or steer a course beside me over a common route. I shall sing it for the skies to hear, while the stars marvel and the firmament rejoices at the song of his bard, and for those to whom the stars have not begrudged knowledge of themselves and their sacred motions, the smallest society on earth." Manilius here too invokes the exclusivity of mental exploration, here of cosmic phenomena, but he perceives it in more genuinely individual terms than the other authors considered here. And while he does perceive the ascent beyond earthly realms as a property generally available to humanity, he thinks that it reveals itself especially to philosophers and poets. He writes in distinctly esoteric terms and does not regard the wider dissemination of his insights to be a meaningful aim, which appears incidentally fitting, since there's not a single contemporary Roman source extant today which actually engages with the Astronomica. The metaphysical preconditions that become evident in his world of thought, however, echo tendencies that were already previously observed. Manilius too echoes the Platonic notion of souls being divine and descending upon human bodies at birth. He also speaks of the mind ascending with wings, and that this manner of exploration traverses religious notions and the divine. Quote, "Who after this can doubt that a link exists between heaven and man in its desire for earth to rise to the stars, gift outstanding did nature give, and the power of speech and breadth of understanding, and a wing-swift mind, and into whom alone has God come down and dwells, and seeks himself in man's seeking of him." What follows from the consideration of all the previously discussed sources, Plato, Virgil, and Manilius, being but a few of a larger array of classical texts along these lines, is that a flight of the mind, or more generally, mental exploration which breaks the boundaries of earthly realities, became politically charged across classical sources. While Plato had already acknowledged a mental privilege to philosophy over others upon whom less transcendentally charged souls descend, the association between the place and value of cosmological speculation and national poetry in Virgil has, in different terms, also a place in Manilius. He allows, beyond the Platonic idea of the heavenly origins of souls, also for the returning mental ascent of humans in more lasting terms, and writes about the deification of humans. To him, speech or performance can be a way of becoming godlike, and he is, without qualifying undertones, asserting an analogy between the order of space and the Roman Imperium. Perhaps the clearest and most distinctly personalized link appears at the close of Book 4, where Manilius suggests that man is now creating gods and raising Godhead to the stars, and beneath the domination of Augustus will heaven grow mightier yet. In doing so, he echoes tendencies and practices established in the framework of the Roman imperial cult, and mirroring in less equivocal terms a more nuanced tradition of the divinity of kings, which in turn reaches back to Alexander. Less political, indeed, is the more commonly adduced reception of the tropes of mental ascent in Jewish literature, namely the work of Philo of Alexandria, whose Jewish philosophical thinking is profoundly indebted to Platonism. Having written, for instance, in his Questiones in Genesim that, quote, the telos of happiness is the approach of affinity to God, quote, and suggesting that a number of properties, being unknowable and being capable to see all things, are shared between the mind and the divine. He mirrors in many of his writings the flight of the mind motif from Plato's Phaedrus quite directly. The motif is so meaningful to him that it becomes a leitmotif even to Philo's philosophical thought. For instance, in his discussion of Genesis 1:26 and 1:27 in De Opificio Mundi, and the question what it means that mankind is created in the image of God, draws upon this analogy and paints Philo's understanding in remarkably vivid terms. He writes, after the pattern of a single mind, even the mind of the universe as an archetype, the mind in each of those who successively came into being was molded. It is invisible while itself seeing all things, and while comprehending the substances of others, it is, as to its own substance, unperceived. When on soaring wing, it has contemplated the atmosphere in all of its phases. It is borne yet higher to the ether and the circuit of heaven, and is whirled round with the dances of the planets and fixed stars, in accordance with the laws of perfect music, following that love of wisdom which guides its steps, and so carrying its gaze beyond the confines of all substance discernible by sense, it comes to a point at which it reaches out beyond the intelligible world, descrying in that world sights of surpassing loveliness. Unquote. Scholarship on Philo has identified this passage as one of the clearest cases in which he shows this intellectual entanglement with Greek philosophy. Within Philo's thought, it is, as the term flight of the mind suggests more generally, commonly the case that he regards the mind as responsible for guiding the soul in its entirety. Therefore, it is possible, meaningful metaphysical debates elsewhere in classical philosophical literature notwithstanding, to use the term minds and souls interchangeably for the present purposes, especially since in the other sources considered here, the ontological dimension, which interests both Plato and Philo, is not of central importance. In De Opificio Mundi, Philo develops a number of ideas which bridge his Jewish thinking with the Greek environment in which he thinks and writes. He echoes, as both David Rinier in his commentary and Peter Borgen have noted, especially anthropological notions which are shared between Greek traditions beyond Plato, especially in Stoicism, and Jewish thought. In both, an association is made between the soul and heaven and the body and earth. Beyond these dimensions, however, Philo's argument here is decidedly uncharacteristic if compared against other lines of Jewish thinking. While his reticence to think of God in the anthropomorphic terms that he takes Genesis 1 to imply, which he shares with his intellectual predecessor Aristobulus the Peripatetic, in line with a broad tradition of Greek philosophers, including Plato and earlier Xenophanes, this was apparently an issue in Alexandrian Judaism, but it is not debated meaningfully in much other Jewish literature. It is therefore productive in order to establish moments of intellectual tangency between Jewish and Greek literary traditions to introduce a further dimension of such excursions into heavenly ascent that do not place the mental or philosophical dynamics of such things at the forefront, but rather to touch upon questions of authority, as was pointed towards in the cases of Virgil and Manilius. Ancient Near Eastern traditions of flying kings. While, as noted above, the tradition of Alexander's flight to heaven only found substantial literary attestation in the late antique works of Pseudo-Callisthenes, classical scholarship had traced back the intellectual origins of this tradition far into the Hellenistic period and beyond. Across a number of cultures and linguistic registers, there existed across antiquity a famous tradition of flying kings. It is intriguing that the earliest extant examples of them are not indeed of Greek, but of ancient Near Eastern origin. An illustrative example is provided in Herodotus's account of the Achaemenid king Cambyses II, who, whilst ruling in Egypt, which he had conquered after the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BCE, was said to have had the following dream. Quote, Cambyses had a vision as he slept after Smerdis, his brother, had left for Persia, in which it seemed to him that a messenger came from Persia and reported to him that Smerdis was sitting on the royal throne and that his head was brushing the sky. This dream left Cambyses terrified that his brother might kill him and rule in his place. The image which Herodotus employs is common also in the material evidence from Persian royal monuments, in which kings are portrayed as raised in the air. Later images from the Sasanian period even show them being carried by mythical winged beings. That was very good. The origins of the tradition of flying kings, indeed, is much older. It reaches back until the Epic of Etana, whose earliest extant written attestations were produced in the first half of the second millennium BC. The myth, besides considering broader topics, revolves around the strife of the Sumerian king Etana for progeny, which, as he is told by an eagle that he had rescued, is aided by him traveling to heaven to procure the plant of birth. He speaks of a dream in which he traveled to a transcendental realm and observed the goddess Ishtar. Quote, Etana made ready to speak and said to the eagle, my friend, that god let me have a dream. We passed through the gates of Anu, Enlil, and Ea. We paid homage together, you and I. We passed through the gates of Shin, Shamash, Adat, and Ishtar. I saw a house, I opened its seal, I pushed the door open and went inside. A remarkable young woman was seated therein, wearing a tiara, beautiful of feature. The throne was set out, worthy of divinity. Under the throne, lions were crouching. As I went in, the lions sprang at me. I awoke with a start and shuddered. Subsequent to this conversation about a visionary entry into heavenly realms, it is narrated that Etana mounted the eagle and indeed flew towards heaven. While the aims of the travels in question differ between Etana and Alexander the Great, one searches for a way to produce offspring, the other for knowledge about the ends of the world. There are some thematic affinities between the texts. Most striking is a shared description of each king seeing the earth and its sea from above, which are diminishing in size and described with fairly ordinary elements of comparison, a garden plot in the Epic of Etana and a threshing floor in the Alexander Romans. While it is clear that the Alexander Roman shows no direct literary dependency upon its ancient Near Eastern predecessor, but beyond the motif above, there exists between them an intriguing broader line of continuity. Flight here becomes a royal affair and an opportunity for an encounter between humanity and the divine. While in earlier Greek traditions, mythical flights predominantly had served purposes of practical expediency within the logic of heroic accounts, such as Daedalus and Icarus crafting wings to flee from Minos of Crete, or Perseus being gifted winged sandals by Hermes to aid his quest to slay Medusa. The line of literary traditions considered here integrates the flights of kings into frameworks of authority. The royal encounters with the gods do not serve as mere plot devices, but they discuss the legitimacy of specific features of power. Ishtar enables Etana to procreate and to preserve his royal line, while Alexander is told by a heavenly intermediary that his search for perception and understanding of the whole world moves beyond what is accorded to. This adds a further dynamic to the classical tradition, namely the Spannungsfeld of authorization and transgression. To Alexander's travel, there's a subversive quality, since his search for a universal or transcendental knowledge which would set him apart from the horizons of perception available to the rest of humanity, whom it politically subdued, is not divinely premeditated. Etana, on the contrary, had received a dream about traveling to heaven before undertaking this voyage. In this sense, the story of Alexander is also different from other Greek stories of heavenly travel that include encounters with the gods, such as the myth of Ganymede, whom Homer describes as particularly beautiful, so that Zeus had transported him to Olympus by way of an eagle in order for him to serve as his cupbearer. It is clear that these analogies cross the boundaries between early myths and later fabulous stories about nevertheless historical individuals. But they consistently introduce a notion of authority that is lacking, for instance, in Plato. While in the Phaedrus, the capacity to move beyond experienced realities depended on the particular properties of a soul, there appears in the traditions considered at present a consistent motif that separates between two modes. Travel is either initiated by an inspiring experience. This includes hypothetical imaginations, such as Virgil's desire to be inspired by the Muses, or it is transgressive. This is substantiated in the fact that even to the permitted ascent of minds, there are consistently limits. Plato had already asserted this in the following manner, quote, "Few then are the things which remain for which adequate memory is at hand. And these souls, when they see some likeness of things divine, of things there, heavenly things, are astounded and no longer in possession of themselves, and they do not recognize what the experience is on account of not perceiving with sufficient clarity." Philo, too, echoed this dimension and perhaps articulated it even more distinctly. In his account of the flight of the mind in De Opificio Mundi, he too sets out the boundaries of such exploration. He writes, "Seeing even the patterns and the originals of things, of sense, which it saw here, it is seized by a sober intoxication, like those filled with corybantic frenzy, and is inspired, possessed by a longing for others than theirs and a nobler desire. Wafted by this to the topmost art of the things perceptible to mind, it seems to be on the way to the great king himself, amid its longing to see him, pure and untampered race of concentrated light stream forth like a torrent, so that by its gleams the eye of the understanding is dazzled." Thus, even permitted or natural flights of the minds have limits. The kind of universal access to heavenly mysteries and the notion of human apotheosis by way of their mental ascent, which was seen in Manilius, therefore, appears to be an outlier. In summary, therefore, the flight of the mind, which is often predominantly thought of as a metaphysical or theological topos, is also in many ways deeply embedded in literary questions around political authority. The intellectual striving for ascent, which was here traced especially along the lines of Platonic traditions, is encountered also in peripatetic views, such as the one discussed earlier in the passage from De Mundo. Pseudo-Aristotle there adds a dimension in his apostrophe to Alexander, which is here worth revisiting, namely that the interpretation of divine things for the benefit of mankind is preferable to an impossible striving for physical ascent. Herein too lies a political dimension that sees value in the intellectual exploration of cosmic mysteries, preferring a metaphysically preconditioned and therefore permitted ascent to a transgressive attempt at physically penetrating the heavenly sphere. Both lines of intellectual traditions, which in form, scope, and underlying assumptions touch upon each other across the centuries, link the question of the flight of the mind with questions of authority, transgression, and the epistemic boundaries of humanity. This more broadly integrated set of issues can lend itself also in new and productive ways to the understanding of Jewish traditions of antiquity, especially the Hellenistic period, whose understanding can benefit from reading them in a framework of a cultural koine in the Eastern Mediterranean. Jewish polemics against flying kings. Intuitively, earlier biblical traditions portray a decided skepticism about questions of heavenly ascent. An oracle against the king of Babylon in Proto-Isaiah, for instance, taunts the previously considered ancient Near Eastern tradition of flying kings. And the text says, quote, "You, that is the king of Babylon, said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly on the heights of Zaphon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, but you are brought down to Sheol." End quote. This perspective on the ancient Near Eastern tradition never fully subsided in Jewish thought. A number of accounts from rabbinic literature, especially Genesis Rabbah, establish a link between the Mesopotamian king Nimrod and the construction of the Tower of Babel. Of course, even the biblical tale itself is a story of ascent towards heaven, though by very different means than flight, and rests upon the premise of the transgressive nature of such a penetration into this transcendental sphere, while the divine response diminishes specifically the position of power and centrality previously held by the people of Babel, even though in this account it is not tied to any one individual. Separately from this line of tradition, the intersection of heavenly and earthly realms is of consistent interest to biblical authors. Notably, though, for a large part of early biblical literature, it is God who comes down in order to reveal himself to humanity, rather than humanity going up in order to encounter him. Visionary or auditory revelations, especially in the corpus propheticum, but also beyond, have God speak to circumstances of the historical, cultic, and political realities of Israel, but not to larger principles of cosmic order. For instance, the cycle of prophetic visions in the book of Amos, in Amos 7 to 9, for the largest parts displays fairly commonplace scenes, such as locusts, fire, a plumb line, or a basket of summer fruit, which serve allegorical purposes that the prophetic book explains. Only the final vision differs from this paradigm in the book of Amos. With a different expression, Amos is no longer shown things but sees. It describes God standing at an altar. Similarly, also Pentateuchal texts seem to reflect this arrangement of directionality. For instance, if in the self-revelation of God to Abraham in the form of 3 travelers in Genesis 18, or the presence of God on earth in the Exodus tradition in the episode of the burning bush, or in the Sinai pericope. Even further along the line of the ancient Jewish literary tradition, there is an interesting consistency to the directionality of mediation between heavenly and earthly realms. Contact between God and humanity is initiated by God and thus divinely sanctioned. This detail is important, since in the biblical text's estimation, not all claims to knowledge are created equal. Specifically, to refer to a topos that entails mental travel, a distinction is made between true and false dreaming, especially in the book of Jeremiah. Quote, "See, I'm against those who prophesy lying dreams, says the Lord, and who tell them and who lead my people astray by their lies and their recklessness, when I did not send them or appoint them, so they do not profit this people at all, says the Lord." Similarly, in more Greek terms perhaps, Plato has a sense of legitimate and illegitimate mental assent in his Legatio ad Gaia, which provides a critique of the role of the Roman Empire Caligula and discusses the complexities of Jewish life within the Imperium Romanum. Plato writes, quote, "Gaius, that is Caligula's madness, his wild and frenzied insanity, reached such a pitch that he went beyond the demigods and began to climb higher and to go in for the worship paid to the greater gods, Hermes, Apollo, and Ares, who are supposed to be of divine parentage on both sides. Have we learned then from this study so far that Gaius ought not to be compared to any of the gods or demigods, since he does not possess the same nature or substance or even purpose, but lust is apparently a blind thing, especially when it is accompanied by conceit and ambition coupled with supreme power." In contrast to the attempts to approximate the divine realm by Caligula, which here are not merely mental explorations but attempts at apotheosis that, under very different conditions, likely during the principates of Augustus or Tiberius, Manilius had viewed much more positively. Philo makes use in the Legatio also of the story of the Tower of Babel to illustrate human hubris and paints the initiated role of Moses as God and king as a positive counterexample, specifically because it is not transgressive, but rather authorized. Along these lines, the questions of authority and transgression are also guiding this line of Jewish literature on heavenly ascent. Crucially, however, a new tradition is additionally introduced into Jewish thought subsequent to the Babylonian exile and features especially around problems of wisdom thinking before taking on a more developed form in the literature, which is indebted to apocalyptic thinking beginning in the Hellenistic period. Here, the question is not predominantly whence the contact between the human and the divine is mediated, but where it takes place. While revelations are still initiated and mediated from above, the places which human literary figures encounter are notably different and become more regularly also heavenly ones. An earlier intellectual predecessor, perhaps, to this tradition, which does not quite yet depart from earthly realms, is the throne vision of Isaiah 6. Quote, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord," I being the prophet Isaiah, "I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe to me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, now this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, and your sin is blotted out. As Hugh Williamson and others have argued, the vision does not describe a heavenly temple, but rather an earthly sanctuary, namely that at Jerusalem, in which the divine presence was uncontainable. This tradition is likely quite early, since the theological notion of God being present in an earthly temple is substituted within the Isaianic corpus by a wholly transcendent conception of the divine from the Persian period onwards, where it is rather asserted that, quote, it is he, that God, who sits above the circle of the earth, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and who spreads them like a tent to live in. That's Isaiah 40:22. While here mysteries of the divine are explored, it is still God who comes down, rather than a human being rising up. A later text, which fits more actively the paradigm of ascent in connection with negotiations of authority, is the Joseph story. Studies by Frank Krüsemann and more recently Erhard Blum and Christine Weingart have accentuated the position of politics and dominion in Genesis 37 to 50 in an important way. Especially Joseph's second dream, which is a later addition to the narrative, is of interest here. He had another dream and told it to his brother, saying, look, I've had another dream. The sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what kind of dream is this that you had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you? The dream is not least likely secondary, because it's not necessary for the progression of the narrative of Genesis 37, but rather constitutes an interrupting, unexpected doublet. Already in the immediately preceding verses, Joseph had told of a structurally analogous dream in which he and his brothers were binding sheaves on the field as his sheaf stood upright while the others gathered around it and bowed down. Here, however, the same arrangement is transposed into a heavenly realm, and the description portrays Joseph not only as one who glimpses the causes of heavenly constellation, but asserts that he himself was the center of their movement. This implies that the heavenly bodies, which in many mythological traditions of the ancient Near East and also some biblical traditions, for example, Nehemiah 9:6, are said to lie in the dominion of the gods, submit, albeit allegorically, to a human being, thus blurring the ontological boundaries between God and humanity. Joseph, therefore, does not only traverse into a transcendental space, but takes on divine properties too. What is yet unclear in this passage, as opposed to other Jewish literary traditions considered in this lecture, is whether Joseph's ascent is transgressive. While he is rebuked by his father for having assumed a position of authority, the Joseph story later on manifests what Joseph's dream had predicted. It reads, then the Lord exactly. So then it reads exactly, now Joseph was governor of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph also remembered the dreams that he dreamt about them. Rather more unequivocal in the question of the transgressiveness of human speculation about the divine, on the contrary, is the theophany at the end of the book of Job, with a string of rhetorical questions which reveal mysteries about the divine ordering of the cosmos, whilst rebuking Job, who previously, from a position of ignorance, had attempted to discern the moral logic of the divine. Quote, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwinds, where were you when I laid out the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Or have you seen the gates of the deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on earth? Who has put wisdom in the inward parts or given understanding to the mind? In this passage of Job, one likely encounters the flight of the mind topos at length for the first time in Jewish literature, albeit in a paradoxical manner. Job is taken on a tour into transcendental realms and into the ordering principles of the cosmos, though not to elevate his epistemic position, but to make him glimpse the vastness which eludes the human experience. Job is placed not in a position of prominence, but the text rather suggests that his suffering follows from things which he is neither able nor permitted to understand, so that his attempts at arguing it with God are regarded as hubristic. This notion of the epistemic boundaries of humanity is revisited also in the book of Ecclesiastes, which concludes that the only possible course of action in light of this reality is to accept the ultimate transience of things and not to seek an eventually frustrated sense of moral order, but rather to resign oneself to a limited set of certain expectations, namely to eat, to drink, and to be merry. Other literary figures of later Jewish literature, especially of the Hellenistic period, however, are positively enabled to know things about transcendental spaces and heavenly mysteries. The tradition begins already in some of the latest texts within the Hebrew Bible, in which an angulus interpraise guides prophetic figures through visions which clearly now are situated outside any kind of earthly reality. Especially in Daniel and Zechariah, these visions portray a broader, totalized sense of history, and inasmuch as they involve another supernatural world, introduce the genre of apocalyptic into the literary world of ancient Judaism. This introduces a moment of transition and difference, which the close similarities to the ascent traditions from classical and ancient Near Eastern sources notwithstanding, sets the Jewish tradition apart. As was seen above, in the ancient Near Eastern sources, it is specifically kings who fly and travel beyond earthly realms. The traditions of ancient Judaism, on the contrary, undertake here a move which is characteristic for them, especially in the Second Temple period, namely to replace ideologies and images elsewhere reserved for kings with accounts of prophets, priests, and otherwise exemplarized figures that are analogous in content. The final element, which is suggested here to be necessarily introduced into the Jewish tradition through an exchange with Greece, and possibly already also Persia, is a much more expanded literary tradition of heavenly travel. These more substantial accounts of heavenly journeys are especially encountered in sources from the Second Temple period that conform to apocalyptic patterns. The most extensive of these is the heavenly journeys of Enoch in the Book of the Watchers, 1 Enoch 1-36. The Enoch corpus expands vastly on a variant reference in the genealogies of Genesis 5, in which it is suggested that Enoch did not die like all other antediluvian humans, but was enraptured to be with God. The earliest part of the large Enochic tradition, which would keep on being expanded until far into late antiquity, sets out a vision of heaven that is characterized by a description of a heavenly struggle between God and the Watchers, a group of fallen angels who had not remained in the heavenly domain, but rather taught forbidden knowledge to humans. The ensuing divine punishment against which Enoch had unsuccessfully interceded is shown to have been a precondition of the biblical flood described in Genesis 6-9. In the details of Enoch's tour of heaven, as well as remote parts of the earth, important questions of authority and transgression are revisited, which resonate with the previously considered classical tradition. The Book of the Watchers describes, notably in the first person, this transcendental travel as follows. In this vision, I, that is Enoch, saw in my dream what I speak now with a human tongue, with the breath of my mouth, which the Great One has given to humans to speak with them and to understand with the heart. As he created and destined humans to understand the words of knowledge, so he created and destined me to reprimand the Watchers, the sons of heaven. And they led me away to a dark place and to a mountain whose summit reached to heaven. And I saw the place of the luminaries and the treasuries of the stars and of the thunders, and to the depth of the ether, where the bow of fire and the arrows and their quivers were, and the sword of fire and the lightnings. I, Enoch, alone saw these visions, the extremities of all things, and no one among humans has seen as I saw. Enoch is here provided with an explanation of both moral and cosmological order. He is initiated into heavenly mysteries, which are otherwise unattainable from an earthly vantage point, and is even, albeit unsuccessfully, involved in a scene on the transcendental negotiation of cosmic struggles. The Enoch tradition, therefore, blurs a description of cosmic order with the place of a human traveler in it. The Book of the Watchers describes a journey of total understanding, even at times surpassing what is perceivable to lesser human beings. The apocalyptic tradition contains many shadings of such otherworldly journeys. In his seminal study on Jewish apocalyptic literature, John Collins has identified a number of central features which he takes to be characteristic of this literary constellation. Beyond heavenly journeys as such, he observes the consistent presence of formal as well as thematic elements, that featured also in the classical flight of the mind traditions, including an otherworldly intermediator comparable to the heavenly being in the Alexander Romans or the role of the Muses in Virgil, the visionary character of the episodes in question, the description of cosmological and primordial phenomena, and metaphysical questions, here especially on the role of the afterlife. Collins identifies beyond the Book of the Watchers, especially the similitudes of Enoch, the astronomical book, and parts of the Testament of Levi, as belonging to a specific subcategory of heavenly travel accounts with a political shading. Beyond these, a number of these texts feature transcendental journeys which review history in more general terms, including the Apocalypse of Abraham, Third Baruch, the Testament of Abraham, or the Apocalypse of Zephaniah. Besides making theological points, especially the episode of Enoch visiting the hollow places for the spirits of the souls of the dead in the Book of the Watchers, invokes the famous classical tradition of katabasis, which is first introduced in Odysseus' journey to the underworld in Book 11 of Homer's Odyssey, and later taken up, for instance, in Virgil's Aeneid or Ovid's Metamorphoses. Enoch says, or Enoch is made to say, "From there I travelled to another place, and he showed me to the west a great and high mountain of hard rock. And there were 4 hollow places in it, deep and very smooth. Then Raphael, his guiding angel, answered me, one of the holy angels who was with me, and said to me, these hollow places are intended that the spirits of the soul of the dead might be gathered into them. For this very purpose they were created, that the souls of all human beings should be gathered. Thus they were made until the day on which they will be judged, and until the time of the day of the end of the great judgment that will be exacted from them. In this case, as well as notable others, there is an intriguing intersection between the traditions of Jewish and classical literature. It is helpful to acknowledge this link not only as an indication of an intercultural exchange of literary motifs, but as a moment of intellectual exchange in a cultural koine of its societal exchange in the Eastern Mediterranean. While the apocalyptic tradition, as is also evident from the titles of the work mentioned previously only in passing, situated itself profoundly in central and prominent realms of memory of the religious, mythical, and historical world of Israel and Judaism, and availed itself, as Carol Newsom has shown, of already existent genres and conventions of ancient Jewish literature, its mode of thinking, in particular, mirrors aspirations towards knowledge of the divine and philosophical premises of an epistemic accessibility of such contact that had been much more prominently pronounced in Greece and pervade a wide range of classical literature in both Greek and Latin. The closest proximity, indeed, between the classical flight of the mind topos and Jewish writing, however, stems again from Ptolemaic Egypt. The exegoge of Ezekiel the Tragedian, an elusive Jewish writer from Hellenistic Alexandria, is the earliest extant Jewish drama and recasts the biblical story of the Exodus in the form of a Greek tragedy. Of particular interest is one scene which imagines a vision of Moses that not only takes him into heavenly spaces in the interest of bestowing upon him higher understanding, but promises him also worldly rule and authority. So Moses says, I had a vision of a great throne on the top of Mount Sinai, and it reached till the folds of heaven. A nobleman was sitting on it, with a crown and a large scepter in his left hand. He beckoned me with his right hand, so I approached and stood before the throne. He gave me the scepter and instructed me to sit on the great throne. Then he gave me the royal crown and got up from the throne. I beheld the whole earth all around, and saw beneath the earth and above the heavens a multitude of stars fell before my knees, and I counted them all. They paraded past me like a battalion of men. Then I awoke from my sleep in fear. And Moses' interlocutor, Raguel, replies, my friend, this is a good sign from God. May I live to see the day when these things are fulfilled. You will establish a great throne, become a judge and leader of men. As for your vision of the whole earth, the world below and all that is above the heavens, this signifies that you will see what is, what has been, and what shall be. Moses is said here to have accomplished what Alexander had failed at. His view, according to Ezekiel the Tragedian, is all-encompassing and not confined to the limits to which, for instance, the flying Platonic souls or Philo's mind were subjected. Indeed, beyond the cosmic outlook, also the progression of historical time is here equated with the expansion of cosmic space. In the figure of Moses, indeed, two things are combined, namely genuinely divine epistemic capacities, and also the implication known from the tradition of the Alexander Romans and elsewhere that transcendental knowledge also authorizes worldly rule. At the same time, the exegoge broadly invokes Jewish scriptural traditions and integrates also materials from outside the Exodus story, namely the previously considered visions of Isaiah 6 and Genesis 37 into this dialogue. Across all these Jewish traditions of the heavenly travel of exemplarized individuals, there is a shared nuance. The flights to transcendental realms in the literature of Second Temple Judaism remove the element of transgression. They are not subversive or unsolicited, but rather invited through heavenly intermediation. However, the traveling protagonist did not need to seek authority within the narrative logic of the texts in question, but rather the literary traditions in question chose for their accounts protagonists who to informed audiences were already authoritative, such as figures like Enoch, Levi, Abraham, or Moses. Their purpose, therefore, was not the authorization of individuals, literary, historical, or otherwise. They did not only describe that these figures traveled, but what they saw and what meaning follows. Therefore, the readers of these texts, too, were initiated into heavenly mysteries, and the Jewish texts were not merely stories of the authority of individuals, but contributed to the religious self-understanding of Jewish communities who, as recipients of revelation in the second degree, could regard themselves too as elect. Sources from among the Dead Sea Scrolls cast this in arguably the most explicit terms and describe their addressees not only as witnesses, but also as participants in heavenly mysteries who are fashioned according to a pattern which also characterizes heavenly beings. Especially the text Forky Instruction, which stands at an interesting boundary between wisdom thinking and apocalypticism, develops this motif and, without using the previously encountered terms, instructs its addressees to study the secret of being, the raznier, not only for moral edification, but also to aspire to a pattern of holiness which is predisposed to their nature. The classical topos of the authorization of individuals through mental descent, therefore, becomes in Jewish thought a motif of community formation. Conclusions. The motif of the flight of the mind is central to classical philosophy and literature. It expresses a striving for transcendental knowledge, originating from the notion of Platonic realism of the heavenly origins of the soul, which through recollection can strive upwards again, and establishes a privileged epistemic status for those who are enabled to ascend beyond the limits of experienced reality. The range in which this motif is employed spans widely among the literature considered here, extending from metaphysical reflections to the conveyance of knowledge for poetry or politics. In these traditions, however, ascent is never neutral. It oscillates between divinely initiated or mediated authorized glimpses into transcendental spaces and transgressive, hubristic human overreaches. While Plato considered the premise of the capacities of the mind as such, authors such as Virgil and Manilius embedded their notions of the flight of the mind into questions of privileged knowledge and political authority. The discourses of ascent in traditions on Alexander the Great, indeed, considered here especially with reference to Pseudo-Callisthenes and the pseudo-Aristotelian work De Mundo, epitomizes the ambivalence of heavenly travel, which can both be a meaningful philosophical endeavor and a cautionary tale of human hubris. Across these sources recurred that mental or physical ascent was regarded as a privileged point of access to divine realities, which in turn could function as a rhetorical device to authorize philosophers, poets, and rulers. Ancient Near Eastern precedents of these classical traditions, moreover, such as the Epic of Etana and their Greek receptions, could show that also in the widespread motifs of the flight of kings, questions of legitimacy, continuity of rule, and the boundaries of humanity and divinity were entangled and fed into classical perceptions of the flight of the mind from both philosophical and epic directions. Here, and arguably most Hellenistically colored, Jewish philosophical perspectives of Philo of Alexandria, a transcultural nexus of the motif of the flight of the mind of travel and authority, could be understood. Israelite traditions, on the contrary, in both earlier texts of the Hebrew Bible and some of their literary afterlife, expressed a marked suspicion towards human attempts at heavenly ascent. They also accentuated the transgressiveness of attempts to breach this ontological boundary. of heavenly and earthly realms from below, while allowing for a wide literary landscape of divine descent, which mediated religious evaluations of the circumstances of these text times. Additionally, however, a further line of Jewish literature developed in much closer resonance with premises of the flight of the mind, in which exemplarized literary figures travel and are raised upwards and initiated into heavenly mysteries. Characteristically for Jewish thought in the Second Temple period, perspectives which, for instance, in ancient Near Eastern conversation partners were reserved exclusively for kings, were here transformed into a framework in which already authoritative figures from Israelite realms of memory were invoked, such as prophets, patriarchs, and sages. Especially apocalyptic literature elaborated extensive visionary journeys in which figures such as Enoch, Abraham, or Moses are taken into heavenly realms, guided by angelic intermediators, and shown mysteries of cosmic and historical order. Herein, and especially also literature from the Dead Sea Scrolls, such as 4Q instruction, lies a crucial shift. Whereas classical traditions beyond Plato especially reflected upon the ascent and authorization of individuals, poets, philosophers, and kings, Jewish ones deployed the literary conveyance of heavenly mysteries through the vantage point of apocalyptic travel accounts to allow their intended readers to participate in this experience and to facilitate community formation among those who, by implication, thereby also became themselves initiated. The recipients of these texts are drawn into the revelatory process themselves, instructed to share in the perception of cosmic order, and thereby regarded metaphysically in a manner which resembles the heavenly associations of Platonic thoughts. Taken together, in conclusion, the comparative panorama of classical, ancient Near Eastern, and Jewish reflections on flight of the mind points to a shaded and nuanced, yet nevertheless shared world of thought across a cultural range of the Eastern Mediterranean, in which questions of ascent, knowledge, and authority circulated and took hold in pertinent literary locations. Together, they point towards an intriguing nexus of constructions of knowledge, imaginations of the transcendental, and negotiations of authority in Greece, Israel, and beyond. Thank you very much.